Listener discretion advised, not for little ears. Welcome back to the dark, listeners. I am your tale teller. Tonight we step back over a century to a warm June evening in 1912. We are traveling to the heart of America, to a place where the American dream was thriving, and where the illusion of absolute safety was shattered so violently that the town has never truly recovered. Tonight, we look at a killer who didn't just break into a home, they moved in. They waited in the dark, smoking cigarettes, listening to the laughter of children, biding their time until the house fell completely silent. This is the incomprehensible butchery of the Villisca axe murders. Villisca, Iowa, in 1912 was a picture of Midwestern prosperity. It was a thriving railroad town of about 2,000 people. It had paved streets, electricity, and a strong sense of community rooted deeply in the local churches. Josiah Moore was one of Villisca's most prominent citizens. He was 43 years old, a successful businessman who owned an implement store, selling farming equipment to the local agricultural community. He was well-liked, wealthy, and deeply devoted to his family. His wife, Sarah, was 39. Together they had 4 children: Herman, 11 years old, Catherine, 10 years old, Boyd, 7 years old, and little Paul, 5 years old. June 9th, 1912 was a Sunday. It was also the Children's Day service at the local Presbyterian church, an event Sarah Moore had helped organize. It was a joyous, exhausting day of singing, pageants, and community celebration. The service ran late into the evening. When the Moore family finally walked home, the summer air was thick and humid. Walking with them were 2 neighbor girls, Ina, aged 8, and Lena, aged 12. Their last name, Stillinger. The Stillinger sisters had asked their parents if they could spend the night at the Moores' house, so they wouldn't have to walk all the way home in the dark. They reached the Moore house, a modest white 2-story timber home on a quiet street, around 9:45 p.m. Josiah unlocked the door. The children, exhausted from the festivities, were sent upstairs to bed. The Stillinger girls were given the guest room on the first floor, just off the parlor. Josiah and Sarah retired to their own bedroom on the second floor. By 10:30 p.m., the house went silent. 8 souls were asleep, wrapped in the safety of a small town where everyone knew their neighbors, but they were not alone. While the Moore family had been at church celebrating Children's Day, a stranger had walked down their quiet street. The stranger walked to the back of the house, tested the door, and found it unlocked. They stepped inside the empty, quiet home. They walked past the kitchen, past the parlor, and found a small closet that led up to the cramped, unfinished attic. The killer climbed into the rafters, and then they waited. Imagine the psychological fortitude, the terrifying patience of this predator. They sat in the sweltering heat of an Iowa attic in June for hours. We know this because investigators later found 2 cigarette butts resting on the attic floorboards. The killer had been smoking in the dark, passing the time, staring down through the cracks in the ceiling. They listened as the family returned home. They listened to the heavy boots of Josiah. They listened to the laughter of the 6 children. They listened as the lights were turned off and the house settled into a deep, rhythmic slumber. Sometime between midnight and 5 a.m., the killer descended from the attic. They walked into the kitchen. Early that day, Josiah had been chopping wood in the backyard. He had left his axe in the house. The killer didn't even bring a weapon. They didn't need to. They picked up Josiah's own axe, feeling the weight of the heavy iron head and the sharp polished blade. The killer walked to the master bedroom first. They raised the axe in the dark. The first blow was delivered to Josiah Moore. The heavy blade of the axe was brought down with such devastating explosive force that it completely crushed his skull. The killer struck him again and again, using the blunt side of the axe head to pulverize his face until he was entirely unrecognizable. The swinging was so wild, so violent, that the axe blade gouged the ceiling above the bed. Sarah Moore was next, murdered in her bed before she could even process the nightmare unfolding next to her. The killer then moved to the children's rooms. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and little Paul. They were bludgeoned in their beds, their skulls shattered. There were no defensive wounds. There was no struggle. The killer moved with the silent, efficient precision of a ghost, extinguishing the entire Moore family in a matter of minutes. Finally, the killer walked back downstairs to the guest room. Lena and Ina Stillinger were sleeping in the same bed, but here the horrific choreography of the massacre changed slightly. 12-year-old Lena was the only victim found with defensive wounds, a defensive slash mark found on her arm. She had woken up. She had seen the stranger standing over her with the dripping axe in the dim moonlight. She tried to fight. She had slid down the bed, her body found in a twisted position, but the blunt iron of the axe head silenced her, just as it had silenced the others. 8 people, 6 of them children, butchered in their sleep by a creature. If the killer had dropped the axe and fled into the Iowa cornfields, it would have been straightforward, albeit horrific, massacre. But the psychology of the Villisca killer became profoundly disturbing after the murders are complete. The killer didn't run. They began a bizarre, ritualistic cleansing of the house. First, the killer took Josiah's heavy, blood-soaked axe and rested it against the wall in the downstairs guest room, right next to the bed where the Stillinger girls lay dead. Then they walked into the kitchen and opened the icebox. They removed a 2-pound slab of uncooked bacon. They wrapped the meat in a towel and carried it back into the guest room and placed it on the floor right next to the axe. A piece of a keychain belonging to one of the victims was also found dropped inside a shoe nearby. Why the bacon? Was it an offering? Was it a bizarre distraction for bloodhounds? Or was it the completely irrational act of a mind that had entirely detached from reality? To this day, criminologists cannot definitively explain it. The killer then went to the kitchen sink and drew a basin of water. They washed their hands, leaving the water stain a dark, rusted red. With their hands clean, they began to systematically blind the house. The killer walked through the rooms, pulling clothing from the victim's own dresses. They took skirts, shirts, and undergarments and draped them over every single mirror in the home. They covered the glass panes in the doors. In many historical folklore traditions, covering mirrors after a death prevents the souls of the deceased from getting trapped in the glass. In criminal psychology, it often points to a killer who feels deep remorse or a paralyzing inability to look at their own reflection after committing such an atrocity. But the killer wasn't finished covering things. They walked back into the bedrooms. They took bed linens and articles of clothing and carefully laid them over the shattered, unrecognizable faces of all 8 victims. With the mirrors blinded and the dead hidden from view, the killer walked to the front door, locked it from the inside, took the skeleton keys and vanished into the early morning mist. At 7 a.m. on Monday morning, Mary Peckham, an elderly neighbor who lived right next door, stepped out onto her porch to begin her daily chores. She immediately noticed an eerie stillness hanging over the Moore property. Josiah was notoriously an early riser, and the 6 children were usually running in the yard by sunrise. But the house was completely silent. The shades were still drawn tight. The chickens in the Moore's coop were restless and pacing, waiting to be fed. By 8 a.m., Mary walked over and knocked on the door. No answer. She tried the handle. It was locked tight. She walked to the Moore's barn, let the chickens out, and then called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. Ross arrived shortly after, assuming the family was simply sick or exhausted from the children's day service. He brought his own set of keys, but they wouldn't turn in the lock. The door had been bolted from the inside. Ross walked to a window and peered through the glass. What he saw in the dim light of the downstairs guest room made his blood run cold. He saw the dark, heavy stains falling on the bedsheets where Lena and Ina Sillinger slept. He didn't break the glass. He immediately called the local peace officer, Marshal Hank Horton. Marshal Horton arrived, forced his way through the door and walked into the quiet house. Ross Moore and Mary Peckham waited on the porch, wrapped in a suffocating tense silence. Minutes later, Horton walked out. His face was pale, his hands were shaking, and he looked physically sick. When Ross asked him what was wrong, Horton looked at him and delivered a line that would haunt the town of Villisca for the rest of its existence.
There's somebody murdered in every bed.
The news swept the small railroad town like a wildfire, and what happened next is one of the most catastrophic failures of crime scene preservation in American history. Within hours, a mob of hundreds of townspeople had descended on the Moore property. In 1912, the concept of a secured crime scene was practically non-existent in rural Iowa. Before the state investigators or the coroner could even arrive from out of town, the locals completely overran the house. They wandered through the blood-soaked rooms, they stared at the bodies, they moved furniture, they trampled the killer's footprints into the dirt outside. Some accounts even state that morbid onlookers took fragments of Josiah Shatter's skull as souvenirs. By the time the actual authorities arrived to secure the area, the crime scene was utterly obliterated by the very community that was mourning it. Bloodhounds were brought in to track the killer's scent, but with hundreds of locals having stomped through the yard and the house, the dogs were hopelessly confused. The trail was cold before the investigation even truly began. The police needed a suspect, and in a town completely paralyzed by paranoia, where neighbors suddenly looked at each other with deep suspicion, the authorities began to cast a wide net. By noon on Monday, June 10th, 1912, the town of Villisca had fundamentally changed. A town that had proudly never locked its doors suddenly descended into absolute, blinding panic. Hardware stores completely sold out of deadbolts, padlocks, and firearms within hours. Farmers who usually left their tools in the yard brought their axes, pitchforks, and hammers inside, hiding them under their beds. Families refused to sleep in separate rooms, dragging mattresses into the parlor and huddling together with loaded shotguns resting on their knees. The monster, that creature, had struck in the dark, and for weeks the people of Villisca refused to let the dark take them. But fear demands a face. The town needed a villain that could understand, someone they could point a finger at and lock away so they could sleep again. The local authorities, completely overwhelmed and out of their depth, called in the State Department of Justice and private investigators from the Burns Detective Agency. And as the detectives began to dig into the pristine, God-fearing facade of Villisca, they found deep, festering resentment. They found 3 prime suspects, and the first was a man who practically owned the town. Frank F. Jones was a prominent local businessman and an Iowa state senator. If you wanted to do business in Villisca, you did it through Jones. For years, Josiah Moore had been Frank Jones' golden boy. Josiah worked at Jones's implement store, learning the trade and building deep relationships with the local farmers. But Josiah was ambitious. He eventually left Jones's employment to open his own competing store, and he didn't leave quietly. Josiah took the highly lucrative John Deere franchise contract with him, dealing a massive financial blow to his former mentor. But the animosity wasn't just financial, it was deeply personal. Rumors tore through the town that Josiah Moore was having a quiet, illicit affair with Frank Jones's daughter-in-law, Donna. To a man like Frank Jones, who valued his reputation and his empire above all else, Josiah Moore was a walking, breathing insult. The theory proposed by an aggressive private detective named James Newton Wilkerson was that Frank Jones had hired an assassin. Wilkerson publicly accused Jones of paying a hitman to wipe Josiah off the map, to reclaim the John Deere contract, and to bury the family's shame. It was a compelling, scandalous narrative that split the town in half. Friends stopped speaking to friends. The Methodist Church and the Presbyterian Church drew battle lines depending on which man they supported. But there is a glaring, fatal flaw in the hired hitman theory. Assassins are professionals. They operate with speed and efficiency. A hired gun walks in, shoots a target, and vanishes. They do not use a dull, heavy axe found in the backyard. They do not linger in the house for hours. They do not carefully drape skirts over the mirrors, wash their hands in a basin, and leave a slab of raw bacon on the floor. Most importantly, a corporate hitman does not bludgeon 6 innocent sleeping children to death. The sheer messy, psychological excess of the crime scene practically screamed that this was not a business transaction. It was the work of a deeply disturbed, disorganized mind. Frank Jones was investigated thoroughly, but no hard evidence ever linked him to the massacre. He was never charged. If it wasn't the bitter rival, then the investigators had to look for a creature, and they found one standing in the pulpit. Reverend George Kelly was an English-born traveling minister who had been visiting Villisca that very weekend. He was a small, peculiar man who suffered from severe mental issues and was known to preach fiery, rambling sermons. He had attended the Children's Day service at the Presbyterian Church on Sunday night, sitting in the pews and watching the Moore children and the Sillinger girls perform. Reverend Kelly's movements the next morning were incredibly suspicious. He left Villisca on the 5:19 a.m. train, just hours after the murders were committed, and long before the bodies were discovered by Mary Peckham and Hank Horton. Yet, according to several witnesses on that train, Reverend Kelly was already talking about the massacre. He allegedly told fellow passengers that there were 8 dead bodies in Villisca, butchered in their sleep. How could he possibly know that, unless he was the one holding the axe? In the weeks and months that followed, Kelly became obsessed with the case. He posed as a detective, joining tour groups that walked through the Moore house. He sent long, bizarre, heavily religious letters to the police chiefs, and family members detailing how the killer must have felt. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, Reverend Kelly was formally arrested. During hours of grueling police interrogation, the fragile mind of the minister finally broke. He signed a full written confession. Kelly claimed that he had heard the voice of God whispering to him in the dark. He claimed the voice told him to slay utterly. He said he found the axe, entered the house, and allowed a shadow to guide his hands as he stood over the sleeping family. For the town of Villisca, it was the answer they'd been praying for. That creature, that monster was finally caught. But the justice system requires more than the rambling of a broken man. When Kelly went to trial, his defense team systematically dismantled the confession. They proved that Kelly was a severe schizophrenic who had a documented history of confessing to crimes he hadn't committed just to insert himself into the narrative. Furthermore, Kelly was a frail, slight man. The brutality of the axe strikes, which had gouged the ceiling and crushed bone to dust, required immense physical strength. Strength the defense argued Kelly simply did not possess. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The second trial ended in an acquittal. The Reverend walked free. And so, the investigation turned to its final and most terrifying suspect. A phantom who rode the iron rails across the American Midwest, leaving a trail of shattered mirrors and blood-soaked beds in his wake. In 1912, the railroad was the lifeblood of the American Midwest. It connected isolated farming communities to the bustling cities of the East and West. It brought mail, it brought supplies, and it brought strangers. For the people of Villisca, the train depot was a hub of daily life. But for investigators looking at the slaughter of the Moore family and the Sillinger girls, the track stretching out into the dark represented something far more sinister, an escape route. When local and state detectives began to look beyond the city limits of Villisca, a terrifying pattern began to emerge in the shadows of the Midwest. The Moore family was not an isolated incident. They were part of a gruesome tapestry of blood that stretched across multiple states. Consider the timeline. In September of 1911, just 9 months before Villisca, The Burnham family was butchered in their sleep in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Later that same month, the Dawson family was bludgeoned to death in Monmouth, Illinois. In October of 1911, the Showman family was slaughtered in Ellsworth, Kansas, and just 4 days before the Villisca massacre, the Hudson family was murdered in Paola, Kansas. Special Agent M.W. McClowry, a highly respected investigator from the Department of Justice, arrived in Villisca and immediately saw the Phantom riding the rails. When McClowry compared the crime scene from Colorado, Illinois, Kansas, and Iowa, the similarities were not just coincidental, they were terrifyingly identical in nature and signature. In almost every single case, the killer struck in the dead of night, targeting homes near the railroad tracks. The killer did not bring a weapon, they used an axe found on the property. The killer brutally bludgeoned the victim in their sleep, often using the blunt side of the axe to crush skulls beyond recognition. The killer showed no interest in robbery. Money and valuables were left in plain sight. The killer left a basin of blood water behind after washing their hands. The killer covered the windows, covered the mirrors, and draped clothing or bed linen over the faces of the dead. This was not a local dispute. This was not a hired hitman. This was the work of a highly mobile, deeply psychopathic serial killer. A predator who rode the boxcars, stepped off into quiet towns under the cover of darkness, fed an incomprehensible dark urge, and then hopped back onto a freight train before the sun rose. Inspector McClowry had a name for this phantom: William Blackie Mansfield. Mansfield was a transient, a drifter who rode the rails, but his criminal record was soaked in blood. McClowry suspected Mansfield of not only the cross-country string of axe murders, but of an incredibly horrific crime in Blue Island, Illinois, where a woman, her infant child, and her father were found bludgeoned to death with an axe. That woman was William Mansfield's own wife. The pieces seemed to fit perfectly. Mansfield was a violent, transient man with a history of axe murder, whose path seemingly aligned with the geographical string of killings across the Midwest. In 1916, 4 years after the Moore family was laid to rest, William Mansfield was finally arrested in Kansas City and brought back to the Montgomery County, Iowa, to face a grand jury for the Villisca massacre. The town held its breath. The monster, the creature, had a face, a name, and he was sitting in a jail cell just miles away. But the justice system, bound by facts and ledgers, threw a massive wrench into the narrative. During the grand jury proceedings, Mansfield's defense produced a rock-solid alibi. Payroll records from a meatpacking plant in Illinois showed that William Mansfield had been clocked in and working on the exact days leading up to and including the night of the Villisca murders. Despite Inspector McClowry's absolute conviction, the paper trail could not be broken. The grand jury failed to indict him. William Blackie Mansfield walked out of the courthouse a free man, leaving the investigators holding nothing but cold ash. If we look at the timeline, the exoneration of Mansfield is perhaps the most terrifying outcome possible. Because if it wasn't William Mansfield, who was it? Who was the phantom riding the rails? Who was a stranger who climbed into the Moore's sweltering attic, smoked a cigarette, and waited for the house to fall asleep? To this day, over a century later, the Villisca axe murders remain officially unsolved. The files are cold, the witnesses are all long dead. The town of Villisca, Iowa had moved on, but it carries the scar of that June night like a permanent brand. But the story of the Moore house doesn't end in 1912. Because when a house is the site of such intense, concentrated human terror, when 6 children and 2 adults had their lives violently ripped away in the dark, the energy of that event doesn't just dissipate into the atmosphere. It lingers, it sinks into the floorboards, it stains the walls just as surely as the blood did. Today, the Moore house still stands at the end of that quiet street, but it is no longer a home. It is a museum, and more importantly, it is considered one of the most intensely haunted locations in the United States. For decades, the house sat empty or was occupied by families who inevitably fled, driven out by things they could not explain. Now paranormal investigators and thrill seekers pay to spend the night in the very rooms where the massacre occurred, and the reports that come out of that house are deeply, profoundly unsettling. Visitors report the distinct sound of children laughing and playing in the empty, dark bedrooms. They hear the heavy, methodical thud of boots climbing the wooden stairs. Doors slowly creak open and slam shut on their own. In the downstairs guest room, where 12-year-old Lena Stillinger fought for her life, people report an overwhelming sense of dread, a feeling of being watched from the corner of their room. And then there is the attic. The cramped, sweltering space where the killer waited for hours. People who climb into that attic report sudden, violent drops in temperature. They capture electronic voice phenomena, EVP recordings, of a man whispering in the dark. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, the psychological weight of the Villisca house is undeniable. We cannot talk about the legacy of the Moore house without acknowledging the modern horrors that have unfolded within its walls, because when a structure is saturated with that level of profound sudden violence, it acts like a sponge for human paranoia. In November of 2014, the dark energy of the Villisca house made national headlines once again. A seasoned paranormal investigator named Robert Lawson was conducting a solo overnight stay. He was locked inside the house, equipped with audio recorders and cameras, seeking the ghosts of the Moore family. Sometime in the middle of the night, while investigating the cramped, oppressive space of the bedrooms, something went catastrophically wrong. Lawson suffered a massive psychological break. In the very house where 8 people were violently slaughtered, he drew a knife and stabbed himself deeply in the chest. He was rushed to the hospital and miraculously survived his self-inflicted wounds. But to this day, Robert Lawson has never publicly spoken about what he saw, heard, or felt in the dark that drove him to plunge a blade into his own heart. Did the isolation break him? Did the psychological weight of the history crush his rationality? Or is there truly something predatory still lingering in the rafters of Villisca, Iowa? We will never have all the answers. The Villisca Axe murders remain a horrifying testament to the fragility of our safety. It is a stark reminder that a lock on a door is merely a social contract, and the monsters, those creatures that we call killers, that we fear, are not supernatural demons. They are flesh and blood, and sometimes they are sitting in the attic waiting for us to fall asleep. The town of Villisca relied on innocence. They relied on faith, community, and a deeply held belief that evil simply did not board the trains that passed through their quiet streets. They left their doors unlocked because they trusted their reality, and a phantom with an axe used that very trust to turn the Moore house into an abattoir. The terrifying truth, listeners, is that a lock on a door is merely a social contract. It is a piece of metal that only works against those who have agreed to play by the rules of society. When a mind completely detaches from empathy, when a predator decides that your home is their hunting ground, the walls we build become nothing more than a trap. When you go to sleep tonight, listen to the wind against the glass. Listen to the creak of the floorboards as your house settles into the cold. And remember, there are creatures we fear that aren't always scratching at the outside of the door. Sometimes they are already in the rafters, waiting for us all to sleep. Thank you for braving the absolute dark with me tonight. Looking back over our century at the scars left on a quiet Iowa town takes a heavy toll, and I am honored that you chose to walk this path with me. If you've survived the attic of the Moore's house, please make sure you hit the subscribe button, leave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and share this episode with a friend who appreciates a true historical, psychological mystery. The algorithm is relentless, and your shares and reviews the absolute lifeblood of this show. But before I lock the studio doors for the night, I have to take a moment to honor the inner circle, the people who stand on the perimeter or are directly at my right shoulder, in some cases, who fund the research and who ensure that we can keep digging into these forgotten, terrifying corners of history. I am talking, of course, about my incredible Patreon community. First up is a fantastic friend of mine, to my Ode Night Tea Titan, Matto Star. Matto Star! Matto, Star, Matto, my friend, your sheer generosity and constant, unwavering support continue to blow me away. I have to ask you about the bizarre post-murder rituals in Villisca. When you look at the slab of bacon left next to the axe, or the clothing draped over every single mirror in the house, where does your logic land? Was it a superstitious ritual by a traveling serial killer, or the frantic remorse of someone completely losing their grip on reality? I mean, really? A slab of bacon on the floor? What does it mean? Let me know your theory. Thank you for everything you do for this show and me. Thank you for the constant communication and the wonderful messages. Talk about brightening up my week and then some. You're a superstar. Thank you for being amazing. And now onto my white tea warlords. First up is Lezosaurus Rex. You superstar, you my gym giant. Thank you for holding the line with us week after week. The sheer explosive physical brutality required to swing a heavy axe with such devastating force in the dark is terrifying. It is a chilling reminder of what the human body is capable of doing when the mind breaks. Thank you for being such a solid, incredible pillar of our true crime family, and you are an absolute superstar, Leza. May your gym session be filled with gains and brilliance. You are an absolute legend. Have a great week ahead, Leza. My next white tea warlord, Maya, our resident queen of the cats. I hope the feline protectors were on high alert tonight. After hearing about the phantom smoking cigarettes in the Villisca attic for hours, the comfort of a safe home feels incredibly fragile. Give the familiars an extra treat tonight, please, on my behalf, for keeping the perimeter secure, and thank you for your incredible continued support. Have an epic week ahead, Maya, and thank you for being absolutely brilliant to me. Thank you. And my next white tea warlord, Sangeetha, our resident seer. With all the physical evidence trampled by the townspeople and the investigation botched from day one, I wonder what your intuition tells you about Reverend George Kelly's confession. Do you think a shadow really guided his hand? Or was he just a broken man desperate to be part of the nightmare? Thank you for sharing your sight with us and for being such a wonderful, vital part of this journey. And what are your thoughts, Sangeetha, on the chunk of meat left on the ground? And that's to all my white tea warlords, of course, and to my own night tea titan. What do you think was the reason behind leaving that chunk of meat on the ground? To confuse, to dissuade, to put people off the track? And finally, a massive, resounding shout out to my Earl Grey enforcers. You hold the line, you keep the gates locked, you help ensure that I have the ultimate freedom to dive into these chilling rabbit holes without hesitation. I couldn't do this without you having my back as well. I am lucky to have Chad Warren, Peter Raffaelli, Joss Heather, Juicebox Andy, Divided by Zero, Paige Kramer, Jane Gumnick, Michael Krupp, and Steve the Creeper. Thank you immensely again for your support. If you want to join this incredible group of people, gain access to early episodes, and help dictate the mysteries we cover next, and support the show directly, head on over to the Patreon link in the show notes. Or otherwise visit www.patreon.com/SFGT. Until next time, keep your digital footprint secure, check the locks on your doors, look up at the ceiling every once in a while, and remember, the world is full of ghosts and not all of them are dead. I am your tale teller, and you've been listening to Stories Fables Ghostly Tales. Stay safe and see you next Sunday.